alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to A Live After Reading. I'm your host, Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is returning guest and big-time traditional author, Edward Willett. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, how's it going, Ed? You've been up to some stuff lately, I take it.
Yes, I have, and we're going to talk about one of that stuff.
One of those things.
One of those things that is part of that stuff. With the new anthology that I just published, which came out of my podcast, The Worldshapers. And I've got a new novel coming out next year, and so lots going on.
Absolutely. So, what's the anthology? Tell us a little bit about it. Who's in it? That kind of thing.
With pleasure. This is Shapers of Worlds Volume 2, and which obviously shows there was a Volume 1. And the way it all started was, I have a podcast called The Worldshapers, where I interview other science fiction and fantasy authors about the creative process. And I'm also a member of Sask Books, which is the Publishers Association here in Saskatchewan. And I have my own little publishing company, Shadowpaw Press. So I was at the annual meeting of Sask Books in 2018. And they brought in, as one of our guest speakers, a woman from Winnipeg who had kickstarted an anthology through her little company. She had raised a ridiculous amount of money, but she had comic connections, and comics people seem to love Kickstarters. Still, I thought, I know some authors, so I decided to give it a shot. So just because I had to cut it off somewhere, I made it my first-year guest for the first anthology, Shapers of Worlds, and it was successful. I successfully kickstarted that one, and it came out last year about this time, so I decided to kickstart another one this year, and so that was Shapers of Worlds, Volume 2. There it is.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's
nice.
A substantial
Got a
book, 540 pages,
Nice.
140,000 words of fiction. There are 18 original stories and 6 reprints, and they're all people who were guests on my podcast during my second year. So we've got new fiction from Kelly Armstrong, Marie Brennan, Helen Dale, Candace Jane Dorsey, Lisa Foyle, Susan Forrest, James Allen Gardner, Matthew Hughes, Helly Kennedy, Lisa Kester, Adria Laycraft, Ira Naiman, Garth Nix, Tim Pratt, Edward Savio, Brian Thomas Schmidt, Jeremy Shaw, and me. And then there are also reprints from Jeffrey A. Carver, Barb Handley, Nancy Kress, David D. Levine, S.M. Sterling, and Carrie Vaughn.
Oh, that's that's a good list. You got a lot of big names
list,
there.
Yeah.
You get Nancy Kress and Tim Pratt those are the ones that jumped out to me, but there's a ton of them that actually jumped out to me.
Garth Nix I was very happy with.
Oh, yeah.
Armstrong, having her in. Well, they were all, they're just all great authors. So.
No, well, Nick, I was silly that I didn't even mention Nick. He was one of my favorite authors growing up, I can't believe I forgot about him when I already, I missed that one.
If you go back, the first one had people like John Scalzi and Joel Hartman, and so it's been an amazing experience interviewing these people, and then the fact that they are have been willing to contribute to these anthologies, and the fact that there are people out there who are willing to give me money so that I could pay the authors so that I could produce the anthology.
Yeah, it must be nice.
Almost all the money from the Kickstarter went to pay the authors. And a little bit of production costs and, postage for backers and all that sort of thing. I think I underestimated what I needed this year, but I'll eventually make it back.
That's the nice thing about you making a product, too. You have books you can sell and ebooks and stuff as well, I'd assume.
Yeah, and they'll stay on forever. So it's out in ebook, paperback, and hardcover, as is the first. Well, the first one only has hardcover on Amazon, but this one is hardcover available, through any bookstore and ebook in every format you could possibly want it, and trade paperback as well. So, and I've already started working on Volume 3 with authors like Cory Doctorow and F. Paul Wilson. I've offered reprints since original fiction from Cat Rambo, and I can't even remember everybody now. There's already about 20 authors signed up for that one now.
Well, you got 24 in this one, right? Or 23 other ones.
This next might only be about 20, but it's still going to be.
That's still a substantial number of authors. Come on. Yeah. I mean, we don't need to listen to you rattle off a bunch of names, especially for a book that people can't actually go out and get yet.
Yeah.
Or won't be able to get out for a while yet. Yeah.
If the Kickstarter doesn't work, then that will be the end of Shapers of Worlds anthologies. But
fair enough. Just keep going until you strike out.
Yeah. Every year it's a new challenge. But all the authors are also very generous about giving backers rewards. So you can offer things like signed ARCs or collector editions of books and all that kind of thing. That brings in people as well. Very popular is to have your name used in a story. That one was one of my both anthologies. That brought in some good backers.
I'm actually kind of surprised that that's such a popular one in a lot of different story Kickstarters. Like, yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Tuckerization in my own work. I don't have nothing against it when other people do it, but it's kind of weird. Like, I don't quite get it. Why would you want to have a name put into like a? I guess maybe it's because science fiction is a little different than fantasy. Like, I can't put people names in my fantasy necessarily.
Well, I did one. The fellow's name was Ronald Ferguson, and he showed up in Magebane as Ronald Ferguson. So it was, I had to change it because it just didn't fit with my naming conventions. So that can be a challenge in science fiction too. But generally, if somebody's going to offer that, they think they'll be able to use a fairly ordinary name in whatever it is that they're going to use the. Yeah,
absolutely. Like a thriller or something like that makes sense, right? Like modern stories or future stories. It makes more sense.
My wife is actually in one of the stories in the original Shapers of Worlds, one of the Tuckerizations. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, some of the groups I was in, the writing groups, or just the author community in general that I've been part of. Some of those people love that stuff, and was one of the former guests of this podcast, Jared Handley. He's such a ridiculous fan of it. He's like, he wants to be in everything, which is funny because he wants to get killed in everything. He's a goof.
Yeah, that's always a hazard if you're going to be Tuckerized. No guarantee of survival necessarily.
Exactly. So when you approach editing one of these, I mean, I assume you do the editing, or do you have an editor who? Okay, yeah. So when you approach editing an anthology with, especially the big authors here, do you use a lighter touch? Do you even give them suggestions on their stories?
In general, I don't have to do a lot of editing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm working with people at this level. But, there's things that I'll point out, this doesn't make sense to me, or there's, and we all overlook stuff. I mean, that's the value of having an editor of any sort. And I've been in anthologies for, like, Josh Palmachier's Zombies Need Brains anthologies. I've been in a couple of those. And, they come back, and there's things to be marked. And the other thing about working with established authors is that they're used to being edited for the most part, so that they don't get, that makes sense, they just change it. You don't get in a lot of pushback or prima donna behavior.
I suppose, especially if you're dealing with author, especially with traditional authors, I would say, because
and if I do see something and I'll question it, and they might come back and say, well, that was deliberate and here's why it makes sense. And I'll think, okay, I can buy that. So it's just a back and forth. But
absolutely.
I edited every word of every story, except for even the reprints I went over, because there were typos and things in the reprints that had crept in. In some cases, they were, I think the best, was it Nancy Cress's, I think. And there was something about a party that had, I don't remember who was actually there, but somehow, I think because at some point the manuscript had been run through optical character recognition or something, there was a party at which nuns suddenly appeared. There were nuns at the party. I don't remember what the word was supposed to be, but it wasn't supposed to be nuns.
Yeah, that would be an interesting twist to a party for sure. It's like, okay, and I hope they don't have rulers. Let's put it that way.
So you have to watch out for things like that, even in the reprints.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do you write short stories regularly, or
I
more novels?
Write a lot. When I started Shadowpaw Press, I had two projects I wanted to publish first, and the first was a collection of my short fiction. But I literally put every previously published short story I had, and a couple of unpublished ones to get up to. What does it say on the cover? 22. There's 22.
Okay.
22 stories in there. But that had to span, like, the earliest story in there was actually one I wrote for a university creative writing contest. That's probably the one in there that I wrote at my youngest, up to ones that had just come out last year. I've published just a couple of more since then in those anthologies I mentioned. But I don't naturally trend toward writing short fiction. I tend to think in terms of novels, or they turn into novels, or even if I wrote a short story, it's really the beginning of a novel.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
No, I'm kind of the same way. When I don't write it, I mean, so much so that when I started writing short stories for just to practice, right? Because I find it was a good way to practice when I started out, because I could actually finish one, right? I mean, granted, I finished my first novel 20 years ago now, so it's been a bit, and I was never really good at writing short stories when I was a teenager. Let me put it that way. But I wasn't good at writing, period, when I was a teenager. Come on.
Well, I loved writing. I wrote my first 3 novels in high school. So
yeah, me too, actually.
But see,
that's
I also
what I
went
did
to
too.
The long stuff really quick there.
Yeah.
And I always thought I should write short fiction because I'm really old. And this was back in the days when, that was the way you got started, right? You wrote short stories, you sold them to F&SF or Asimov's or Analog or Amazing, and, the short fiction magazines. And then from there, maybe you stepped up and you started writing novels. So I thought that was the way I had to start, but it just was never really my thing very much.
No, that makes sense. It's interesting. I mean, I guess the anthologies make sense just because you have all these connections now. But and also you only write one story per anthology. It's got to be a little easier then.
At the first one, it was really legitimate because I actually interviewed myself on my own podcast. My pseudonym interviewed me on my podcast. He sounds just like me, but with a southern accent. That was a lot of fun to do. So Ed, now tell me about this latest book you've written. I'd say, oh yes, well, EC, it's like this. my editor got a kick out of that because, of course, she published at DAW, Sheila Gilbert. She's published me, Edward Willett, but she published E.C. Blake, who wrote the Master Agreement trilogy, and that was the pseudonym that was publishing me. So it was like 2 DAW authors talking to each other, even though we were the same person. Anyways, I literally was one of my guests on my first year of my own podcast. That's
pretty funny. I didn't know.
I just put my story in because I'm the editor and I can do that. So.
Yeah, you've got the so I guess I would pay for my story. I would put this story in there. That would make sense.
It was great to be able to introduce the characters for my upcoming novel. So I had something I could do there, so it fit really well.
Oh, good. So, as far as your creative process with approaching a novel, I don't remember if we've talked about this before, because actually we haven't talked a whole ton of times. So when you approach, like, just generally writing something, do you approach it through the world first, or do you approach it through characters first? Which is your preference?
It varies from book to book and how the idea came along. I think generally, though, I tend to have an overarching world, I guess, or universe,
or like an event or something like that.
Yeah. That then the characters arise out of as I start to build a story from that. So if I think to my DAW novels, actually, my first one started as a short story. Oddly enough, and got turned into a novel. I don't remember where that one came from, but I'm sure that the world came before the characters really came. And I would say that's more common. Like for The City Born, which came out not too long ago, I had this mental image of this city crouched over a ravine, and it had been there so long that the ravine had filled up with the garbage and refuse that was thrown out of this city, and there were people living in the garbage. So it was very much that kind of mental image. And then, okay, so who would be living there and who'd be living in the city, and that's where your characters come from. So I would probably say the world first, for the most part.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, at least it makes sense to me, because that's pretty much how I would roll, too. Typically, I have an idea for whatever, this premise, basically, this kind of setting or technology or whatever.
Or a magic
system or any of that stuff. And then I develop the characters that make sense or that jump out to me from that universe. But I have lately been more character-driven, which is kind of what spurred this question. I've been more like, do I really need to develop the whole setting around this thing? But then when I get too far in, I'm like, okay, now I know more about the characters than I know about the world, and that actually crushes me. It's funny. Do you ever have problems with overweighting one element? I mean, when you're in your process, obviously, I'm sure by the time the books come out, they're fine. But does that ever give you trouble?
Well, there's the old The big the big problem in science fiction and fantasy is often how much information about the world do you dump on people, and when and how do you get that information out? I think that's often a challenge because, of course, we often know our worlds very well, and once you start writing about them, it's like 4,000 years ago when so-and-so happened, and then let's move forward in time to 3,000 years ago, and then 300 pages later you say, meanwhile, back at the castle. You have to watch out for that kind of thing.
And then the book started.
Yeah. So you do have to be a little careful of that, and sometimes I might find that I'm trying to cram too much of that information in that is really necessary when, in fact, it could be dribbled out a little bit more through the characters' interaction, because that's the ideal way. So maybe sometimes, yeah. Now, on the character side, it's interesting because my Worldshapers series, 3 books from Daw, came out. The last one was called The Moonlit World. Because of the kind of premise it is, which is this vast labyrinth of shaped worlds where they're all shaped by people from our world, but they're basically blank slates, and they can make them into anything they want. So we have the Moonlit World is a vampire werewolf world. The one before that, Master of the World, was a Jules Verne world. That one really is very much driven by the character, because that's the continuing theme. Aside from this whole overarching premise, it's really this woman who's very much like a woman from our world, even though she was a shaper. She forgot that she was a shaper. And she's going from world to world and trying to gather information about them. And so it's very much driven by her and her sense of humor, really, which happens to be my sense of humor, because she's steeped in pop culture, which is pretty much the same in her world as ours. So I can make Star Trek jokes and Star Wars jokes, and Game of Thrones jokes, although I think that one I changed a little bit because the timing didn't quite work, so it was called, like, I don't know, not Game of Thrones, but something like Challenge of Castles or something like that. So that one is very much... So in that case, it's a premise that generated a character who then drives the rest of the books.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Started with the premise, but the character then becomes more important and starts to be what drives what's going to happen further down in the series.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you say that, because when you approach a book in general, I mean, like, obviously, I find that the book, I mean, when I'm writing a book, I always have to do it through a character, but then I always have to do it in a setting, right? Like, so it's this interesting, like, layers of how close you can get to your material, in a way, or how directly you're interfacing with that premise you've got there.
Yeah, and it also depends, of course, on your viewpoint, because if you're doing a first person, the character's all important, really, because that's everything is seen through that one character. Once you start pulling back, and if you pull all the way back to, like, omniscient third person, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, up there, then that's a completely different way of how the story is going to come out and what will get weighted. So you'll have important characters, but they're presented as if you're watching them on a stage, as opposed to being inside of them in quite the same way. And there's all sorts of levels in between there. But yeah. If you're first person, though, the character has to take over, because there's just nothing else there, really, except what this person thinks about what she or he is seeing around them. Everything has to be filtered through that one brain.
Though it's interesting because because it's all filtered through the character, it makes exposition a little easier sometimes. If the setting's kind of in depth, the character could be like, well, this is how it is. You can actually have them do that. And if you do it in their voice, it can still be interesting to some extent. And you can, you can more directly exposit some details. Pretty handy.
What I did in Worldshapers, actually, and also in the Tangled Stars, the new one that's coming up, is a mixture of first person and third person. So I do have one main first person narrator, but the two other main characters, who are also viewpoint characters, I narrate them in third person. I don't know if that's very common or not, but I got used to doing it in the Worldshapers series, and it's interesting to do that play of the different ways of telling the story, with one viewpoint a little bit more distant and then one right there in somebody's head. I don't know. For some reason, it's working, so that's what I'm doing.
No, I mean, I read, what was it, Patient Zero by Jonathan Mayberry. I read that one years ago now, and that had a similar thing going on. Like the main guy, the main hero character, you get his first person narration, but then it's a modern thriller with zombies. It's like 24 with zombies, something like that. I think was the pitch for it at the time because it's an older book now. And I would not pitch anything. I don't think anyone would pitch anything as like 24 meets X anymore. That's a little bit dated at this point. But when but that was like. Yeah, there was a bunch of ancillary points of view, like all the villains and stuff. But whenever you were in the main character's point of view, and it inspired me. I actually wrote a series that also did that.
It gives you some opportunities to do things different than if you're just stuck into first person throughout. Yeah,
definitely. Though, though it can be, I don't know. Have you ever? What have your readers thought of that? I'm trying to say, yeah, because it's interesting because it's not all that common to see. I mean, I can name a few books that do it, but it's probably one of the more unusual options.
Nobody has commented on it to me, so
oh, nice.
Or in the reviews that I've read, I haven't seen anybody comment on that particular choice. As being odd or striking them as odd, and
that's got to work. That means it probably is working then. Yeah.
Sheila Gilbert, who's seen Hugo Award-winning editor and has seen, at this point, who knows how many hundreds of published novels that she's worked on, seem to think it works. So, okay, good enough for me.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, and it is nice. I mean, you get that kind of validation, that stamp of approval has got to be helpful on some level for morale, maybe.
Yeah, I guess. Although we're all still racked with doubt every time we start a new project. So. I haven't talked to a single author yet who always feels like they nail it every time. So.
I mean, not every time.
Yeah. You can feel confident, but of course you tend to try to stretch your boundaries as you continue to write.
Yeah, absolutely.
Try to do something more challenging or different, which this was for me. And so there's always that risk of, maybe this time I went in the wrong direction? And, there have been one or two things I would change over the years. I probably in some of the books looking back at them now, but when I was writing them, I didn't know.
Yeah,
them, so.
No, definitely.
Hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah, and if you're honest with yourself about, when you're editing the book and you're like, that's what I find anyway that works for me, is if I'm honest with, this is a problem. If it's because usually I can see if there's a problem, and it's just, do I sweep it under the rug and say, no, I don't want to fix that, which is what I would do when I was like a teenager. Or do I go back and I actually fix it? And I just like, no, that I had a bad feeling about that. And usually that feeling means something, It's worth changing those details or changing that, even the big stuff, Yeah,
I think when you do this a long time and you've worked with other editors and stuff, I know sometimes that there's something in my draft that I'm submitting that Sheila's going to come back and say, you need to fix this. And I still have, somehow I think that I'm going to maybe sneak it by her or something, but it never happens. And then it comes back, yeah, I knew that. I should have fixed that. Hoping you wouldn't notice, but somebody always notices. So there's no point in lying to yourself. If you sense a problem, fix the problem.
Exactly. And I mean, and then there's also the other end of that is kind of where I'm like, well, I think this will be a problem. And that, but usually is like the thing people are actually going to like about a story. Does that ever happen to you, where you're like, no, this is too much. I shouldn't do this, and then you end up trying it, and it anyway.
I don't think I've ever felt I did anything that was too much. If I put it in there, it felt just right to me.
Okay, I guess maybe that's just me being a little more maybe sheltered or repressed or something, because I'm talking about stuff that like content stuff specifically.
Oh, well, I guess I maybe have done one or two things where I actually asked Sheila. I said, "Is this too much considering?" And she said,
"No." Yeah, exactly. It's like I find that's my biggest problem. Is like I'm holding back. I need to stop doing that.
Years and years ago, when I was probably still a teenager, and in a way, my parents literally were looking over my shoulder as I was writing. I read some author who said that if you were going to be a professional writer, you had to stop writing as if your parents were looking over your shoulder, or your mom was looking over your shoulder.
Yeah. Or like every writer has to pretend they're an orphan. Something like that is the one I've heard.
Yeah, it's very similar. You have to kind of you can't write to what you were when you were a kid and you had so many restrictions placed on what you could say, or you have to sort of let some of that go. And it took me a long time to use swear words in my, and I still use them rarely because I think they carry way more impact if you save those words for when you really need to heighten up some emotional reaction. Whereas, I don't know, people say, well, realistically, people swear all the time. And they do. And if you're writing realistic dialogue, sure, but it does lose some of its power. And then to try to find how you ratchet up a notch to show that somebody is really, really upset or angry, if you've held back on that a little bit, it gives you some place to go.
That makes sense, especially because dialogue, especially when you take into account that dialogue isn't like you don't say ums and ahs. And what I just did here, where I stopped one sentence and kind of just started a different sentence, that's not what you do in fiction because it's easier to be clear. Yeah, and it makes more sense to be clear when you're writing
the podcast
fiction.
Episodes, I did full transcripts. Although I stopped because time eventually it's just got to be too much. Even using automated transcription software. But when you start looking at what you actually say in an interview like this, or any time when people are talking, and you realize that you can't reproduce real dialogue because it would look nuts on the page. It would be
it'd be insane. It would be maddening. Yeah. So you got this new book you're working on, this novel that's coming out next year, you say?
Yeah, it'll be about this time next year.
Okay. What's that about? What's up with that one?
It's called The Tangled Stars. It's a far future space opera, humorous space opera. The main character is Cooper, is his name, Coop. And he's kind of a bit of a thief. He calls himself a pre-salvager. Everything ends up as salvage. He just does it before it gets to that point. And he's living out in the outer system, and this is the overarching premise, and where the title comes from, is that there was interstellar travel through what are called masts, multiverse-adjacent space-time tunnels, masts. And each one is basically a wormhole, but it sounds fancier. And each one would take you to one specific system, but then something happened. They tried to open another one out of Earth's system. There's only one out of Earth. And they tried to open a second one, and something happened. There was some rebound of energy, and the whole system went down. And so there are colonies out there, but they're all cut off from Earth. And there's no interstellar travel, but you have interplanetary travel. And there was a lot of damage caused by the backlash, and so it took a while to recover. So you have outer system, he's out there, and then he discovers, while he's trying to chase down a piece of salvage, that the wormhole, the mast, has reopened. But he has trouble right here in River City. He has somebody trying to catch up with him because he owes money to somebody that's really bad to owe money to. And he needs to get out of the system, so he thinks, if I could go through this thing.
No one will ever find me.
I said, but you can't take an ordinary ship through. There's only one ship that you can take through it, so he has to recruit this woman that he knew, who's now a cop on Mars, has to recruit her, and they have to steal this starship from Earth. And that's where most of the action takes place in the first book.
So it's kind of a heisty, capery thing.
It is. There's kind of a heist going on. There's a talking cat, which I think is very important to have.
Yes.
An AI uplifted cat. So he's actually in the story in Shapers of Worlds Volume 2. His name is Tybalt. And he's like first mate on this guy's vessel. And so he's involved in all this. And there's a lot of stuff about AIs and dealing with them, and they have to steal this starship. And meanwhile, the guy that Coop owes money to is still after him, and now he finds out about this wormhole being opened. Now he wants the starship, so he's chasing them. And then when they get through the wormhole, that's not really a spoiler because obviously they do, or what would be the point of the story. Then they find out that things are really screwed up in these other places as well. So if the series continues, then we'll have more adventures out in the wider interplanetary. And it's called The Tangled Stars because they find out that the wormholes no longer go where they used to. They seem to go off who knows where. So.
We are rerouting your transport. Your wormhole is going somewhere new.
And I know what's behind it all, of course. But
of course.
I wouldn't get to that for a while, depending on how many books I can sell in the series.
Well, great. Edward Willett, it's been great having you on the show. Tell people where they can find your stuff. And, just generally your presence online.
Well, my books are available everywhere. Any online bookstore you want to purchase them from, you can find find them. Both my traditionally published books and the ones I put out myself through Shadowpaw Press. You can find me at edwardwillett.com. That's 2 T's on Willett, Willett. I'm on Twitter at @ewillett. I'm on Facebook at edward.willett because I missed the memo about having the same handle for all your social media. I'm on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor, so there's another one. Shadowpaw Press is shadowpawpress.com. You can also order these books directly from Shadowpaw Press, and I even offer free shipping in North America for books ordered through Shadowpaw Press. And you can also download the ebooks directly from there as well, which is the way I make the most money, so I highly recommend it.
Yeah, you got to plug that one. I mean, I mostly read ebooks now. I actually pretty much can't read print books, so I mean, I can, I just don't like to. I got the big claw hands, you know. I don't like roughing up books. I'd much rather just read on my phone.
I like the ebooks because they're big. I like to read on my iPad, big and bright, and easier to read for us old guys.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, thanks again for being on the show. It's been fun. And as for this podcast, you can find more of this show at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can find my blog, dwellerofthedeep.wordpress.com, because I never mentioned that one, but that's where you can find kind of irregular blog posts about writing and other such things. And you can also find my books on timniederreiter.com/books. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good week. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
That tears it.